In my 40 years on these tracks, I've learned that some schedules aren't written in ink, but in blood. You might find it hard to believe, but tonight I stood face to face with the ghost of the Great War. You see, this soldier has been waiting for a train that was cancelled in 1914, and tonight he decided to ask me why it's so late. It was a Thursday, and the world was beginning to slip into its nightly slumber. I was at the station, and it was around 11 p.m. The last of the city-bound commuters had vanished long ago, leaving nothing behind but the hollow hum of the overhead lights and the lonely whistle of the wind through the steel rafters. The station, usually a place of movement and noise, felt like a cathedral of iron and silence. I was doing my final rounds, the rhythm of my boots on the cold stone floor sounding like the slow, steady ticking of a clock in a vacant room. I've always loved the station at this hour. It's when the walls whisper the secrets of a million journeys. But that night, the whispers were different. They didn't sound like the echoes of travelers. They sounded like the gasping breath of a tired world. Suddenly, the air shifted. It didn't just get colder. It turned heavy, metallic. A thick silver mist began to crawl over the edge of Platform 4. It wasn't the soft, damp fog of the valley. This was something else. It was a suffocating shroud that smelled of burnt matches, sulfur, and wet, disturbed clay. It rolled across the tracks like a living thing, swallowing the yellow lines in the rusted rails. And there, sitting under the dim, flickering glow of a single lamp, was a man who shouldn't have been there. He was sitting on the very edge of the wooden bench, his back as straight as a bayonet. He was young, painfully young, perhaps no more than 19. He was dressed in a thick, wool-green infantry uniform, the kind you only see in the sepia-toned photographs of a museum. His gear was archaic: leather webbing, a tin canteen, and a long wooden rifle propped carefully against his knee. But what caught my eye was the mud. His boots were caked in a grey, thick, viscous clay, the kind of mud that only exists in the hellscapes in a trench. And it was wet. It was dripping slowly onto my clean platform. I approached him with a cautious heart, my lantern trembling in my hand. The golden light of the flame danced across his face. He was pale, his skin the color of ash, with smudges of soot across his cheekbones. His eyes were wide, fixed on the dark mouth of the tunnel where the tracks disappeared into the night. They weren't the eyes of a living boy. They were two hollow wells of sorrow that seemed to be staring at something miles or years away. "The last train is gone, son," I said softly, my voice cracking in the cold air. "The station is closing. You're waiting for a ghost." He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just reached into his tunic with a slow, mechanical stiffness, his fingers fumbling with a pocket. He pulled out a tarnished silver watch. He didn't look at me, but he held it out toward the lantern, the cracked glass catching the yellow light. "Sir," he whispered. His voice didn't sound like it came from his throat. It sounded like a distant echo from a deep, dark well, or the rustle of dry leaves skittering across a grave. "Sir, I've been sitting here since the whistles went silent. I have my orders. I have to reach the front by dawn. I have a letter in my pocket for a girl who's waiting at the garden gate. She told me she wouldn't leave the gate until I came home." He finally turned his head. The movement was jarring, like a wooden doll being moved by invisible strings. "Tell me, sir," he continued, his voice trembling now, "why does the 11 p.m. express never come? Why is the world gone so quiet? I can hear the drums in my head, but I cannot hear the engine. Has the war moved? Have they forgotten I'm here? I looked down at the watch in his palm. My blood turned ice. The silver was black with a century of oxidation. The hands weren't just stumped. They were fused together by a thick orange crust of rust. They were frozen at exactly 11 o'clock. I looked at the tracks, then back at his weary, haunted eyes. I realized then that I wasn't looking at a passenger. I was looking at a man who had been left behind by time itself. He was waiting for a train that was vaporized by a shell in a forest in France before I was even a thought in my mother's mind. "Son," I started to say, my heart hammering against my ribs, that train isn't coming." And as the words left my lips, the mist around his feet began to swirl violently. The smell of sulfur intensified, and for a split second, the station walls seemed to dissolve. In the reflection of the station windows, I didn't see the platform. I saw a landscape of barbed wire, broken trees, and fire. The soldier stood up, clutching his rifle. "It has to come," he said, his voice rising at a desperate, ghostly pitch. "Because if it doesn't, then I never went home. And if I never went home, then what am I?" He stepped toward the edge of the platform, the wet mud from his boots leaving dark, heavy footprints on the stone. He looked into the tunnel, waiting for a light that would never shine. I stood there paralyzed, the lantern slipping from my numb fingers. I realized that the nightmare was only beginning. The 11 p.m. express wasn't just late, it was a phantom, and it was pulling both of us into a past that refused to stay buried. I stood there on the edge of the platform, the cold air biting at my lungs. The boy, I couldn't call him a man, his face was too young for that, remained focused on the dark tunnel. The silence was so thick, I could hear my own pulse drumming in my ears. I wanted to run. Every instinct I had told me to turn back to my office, lock the door, and wait for the sun to burn this mist away. But I looked at his hands. They were shaking, not from the cold, but from a terrifying, century-old anxiety. "Son," I said, stepping closer until I could see the individual threads of his frayed wool collar. "Let me see that letter. Maybe I can help. Maybe I can find where it needs to go." The soldier froze, slowly, with the agonizing creak of a soul that hadn't moved in a lifetime. He reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a piece of paper. It wasn't white, it was yellowed, brittle, and stained with dark circular blotches that I knew, with a sickening jolt, or blood. "It's for Rose," he whispered. "She's at the gate. She's always at the gate." As he handed it toward me, my fingers brushed against his. My heart stopped. His skin wasn't cold like ice. It was cold like the void between stars. The moment our skin met, the station vanished. The flickering electric lights of Platform 4 were replaced by the blinding, hellish flash of artillery fire. The sound of the wind turned into the deafening roar of 1,000 cannons. I wasn't standing on stone anymore. I was knee-deep in freezing, putrid water. The smell hit me like a physical blow, the stench of rotting earth, chlorine gas, and burned cordite. I saw him, not as a ghost, but as he was then. He was huddled in a hole in the earth, the sky above him a bruised purple, torn apart by streaks of orange fire. He was writing that fairy letter, his charcoal pencil scratching desperately against the paper while the earth shook with every explosion. He wasn't a hero in a history book, but he was a terrified child praying for a whistle to blow so he could leave the mud behind. "The train," he gasped in my ear, his voice now overlapping with the screams of men in the distance. "The train was the only way back to her, but the tracks, they blew up the tracks, sir." Suddenly, the fission snapped. I was back on the platform, gasping for air, clutching the edge of the bench to keep from falling. The soldier was still there, looking at me with those hollow, pleading eyes. I saw it. I breathed, my chest heaving. I saw the fire, son. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed a trembling finger toward the tracks. Listen, he whispered. At first, I heard nothing. Then, from deep within the tunnel, came a sound that shouldn't exist. It wasn't the hum of an electric motor or the screech of modern brakes. It was the heavy, rhythmic chuff, chuff, chuff of a steam piston. It was the clanking of heavy iron chains. And then, a whistle pierced the night, a long, mournful wail that sounded like a woman crying in the dark. A light appeared in the tunnel, but it wasn't the bright LED of a 21st century locomotive. It was a pale, sickly green glow, flickering like a dying candle. The express, the soldier whispered, a terrifying smile breaking across his soot-stained face. It's finally here, the 11 p.m. to the front. But as the engine emerged from the mist, I saw the truth. The train was a skeleton of wood and rusted metal, its carriages filled not with people, but with the same silver mist that had brought the boy to my door. And on the side of the lead car, painted in fading, ghostly white letters, was the date, August 1914. I realized then that the train wasn't coming to take him home. It was coming to take him back to the hut. The ghost train didn't like being denied. The engine let out a final, ear-piercing shriek that shattered the glass of the station clock. With a violent jerk, the rusted carriages began to move, sliding backward into the silver mist. The shadow passengers pressed their pale faces against the glass, their silent mouths screaming as they were pulled back into the loop of history. I held on to the soldier's arm with everything I had. For a moment, it felt like the mist was trying to pull me in too, trying to drag me back to a world of bayonets and gas masks. Then, with a sudden thunderous silence, the train vanished. The mist cleared instantly. The smell of sulfur was gone, replaced by the crisp, clean scent of a winter morning. The station was just a station again, empty, quiet, and modern. The soldier was still standing there, but he was changing. The heavy green wool of his uniform began to fade into a soft, ethereal white. The mud on his boots turned to dust and blew away in the wind. His rifle, once a heavy burden, simply dissolved into the air. He looked down at his hands. They were no longer shaking. He looked at me, and for the first time, his eyes weren't hollow craters of sorrow. They were bright, clear, and full of a peace that passed all understanding. "Is it over, sir?" he asked. His voice didn't echo anymore. It was as clear as a bell. "It's over, son," I replied, my eyes stinging with tears. "The guns are silent. The world moved on. You can go home now." He reached into his pocket and handed me the letter one last time. This time, it wasn't stained with blood. It was clean, white, and smelled of lavender. He gave me a sharp, crisp salute, the salute of a man who had finally finished his tour of duty. "Thank you, station master," he whispered. As the first ray of the morning sun hit the platform, he began to shimmer. He didn't disappear in a puff of smoke. He simply faded into the light, like a dream you forget the moment you wake up. Where he had been standing, there was nothing left but a single tarnished brass button. The next morning, I didn't go home to sleep. I took the letter and drove 3 hours to a small, overgrown churchyard in a village that had once been a farming community. I searched the rows of headstones until I found it. Rose Miller, 1896-1982. Near the bottom of the stone it read, "Waiting at the gate." I knelt down and placed the letter on the grass beside her grave. I also placed the brass button on top of it. As I turned to leave, a soft breeze ruffled the trees, and for a split second I could have sworn I heard the faint, distant whistle of a train. Not a ghost train, but a real one, finally arriving at its destination. I went back to the station that night and sat on the bench on platform 4. The clock struck 11 p.m. The tracks were empty. The schedule was clear. I took out my logbook and wrote the final entry of my career.